Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. It looks like it's 2 o'clock and we have people coming into the lobby. So we are recording and we will start now at 2 o'clock. My name is Aimee Pozorski and I'll be your co-host today. Um, so welcome to this Philip Roth Studies Zoom hosted by the Philip Roth Personal Library. I'm delighted to be here today. I am Aimee Pozorski, your host and former executive co-editor of Philip Roth Studies, a role I shared with Dr. Maren Scheurer, researcher and lecturer at the Department of Comparative Literature and at the Department for English and American Studies at Goethe University, Frankfurt am Main. Philip Roth Studies is a peer-reviewed journal published by Purdue University Press. Our term ended in spring of 2024 when our final issue appeared. Focused on new research made possible by the Philip Roth Personal Library, our esteemed host today, it was a special issue edited by Dr. Ira Nadel, American-Canadian biographer, most notably for this audience, a biographer of Philip Roth, and Professor Emeritus at University of British Columbia. At Roth Studies, when we say special issue, we mean that in a variety of ways. The first is that it would have a specific focus and have a guest editor with corresponding expertise. Over the years, Philip Roth Studies has produced special issues with a focus on Roth and women, Roth and scandal, Roth and transdisciplinary translation, and even Mourning Zuckerman, an homage to Roth's most endearing and infamous alter ego who disappeared from his pages after the 2004 novel Exit Ghost. The special issue of Philip Roth Studies 20.1, with the 20 marking the journal's 20th anniversary, was guest edited by Ira, who knows a thing or two about archival work. The idea was to publish new work by veteran and emergent scholars that better help us understand the novels of Roth by looking at the very books that Roth read in preparation for his writing. A glance at the table of contents of this new issue reveals that we have an essay that takes up the dual endings of Operation Shylock, an essay that interprets Roth's reading of Kafka by looking at Roth's own teaching notes, an essay that looks at Roth's 6 copies of Lolita, Lolita times 6, written by Ira, an essay about Roth as a reader, one that relies on several locations of Roth's archived work across the country, and an essay that I wrote about Roth's interest in Erik Erikson, a psychoanalyst whose research seems, at first glance, far from Roth's own writing. That is the content that we wrestled with. And then there was also the work of corresponding with permissions holders and creating a new house style that allowed us to properly cite from the archives themselves. Most notably, the Philip Roth Personal Library at Newark Public Library, which contains, as you now know, more than 7,000 volumes of books that Roth accumulated from 1950 to the present. One of the arguments I think we can make by looking at the special issue and future work that it produces is that we can tell nearly as much from an author such as Roth from the books that he reads as from the women he dated or where he liked to eat, more on that in a moment, or the important people in his life. Since we have the honor of Maren in the Zoom room with us, calling in from Germany, where it is late at night, I thought I would begin by asking her for about the most difficult part of pursuing this work, as well as perhaps the most rewarding. Maren?
Yes, thank you. I think in so many ways you have also already answered these two questions. And I think they are both related to the fact that this is such new work because the library just became available to researchers like us at the time that Ira approached us with this idea of publishing a special issue just with this kind of work. And so, as you said, I think what was really difficult in bringing this issue together was just finding a system, not just for citations as such, but also, I know how long did we wrestle over the question, how can we represent these varied markings that Roth produced in his books with like underlinings, different colors, and all of that on a printed page that has its own house style that usually doesn't allow for underlining. So how can we do that? Can we put that um, into the journal? And of course, all the fact checking that went along with this archival material without actually having access to the library. So that was really difficult, and Ira helped us a lot in that process. But at the same time, it was, of course, incredibly rewarding being a part of this kind of research and seeing how people came up with ways of using this material in many different ways. I think all of the articles collected in the issue have a completely different approach to how one might use the texts in the Philip Roth Library. And I think that's really exciting because it's yeah, like a little snapshot of all the kinds of like, new work that the Philip Roth Library might inspire.
Thank you, Maren. I don't think that it is too big to say that when we were pursuing this work, we thought of ourselves as representatives of Philip Roth and Philip Roth Studies and the Philip Roth Library, but really we also thought about the work we were doing as academics, as editors, as people in the profession. And so we like to think that the work that we did like resonates beyond Philip Roth Studies. The fact checking is real. I love that Maren brought that up. You know, like the first 9 issues we did together were fairly easy in quotation marks in the sense that we have all of the books of literary criticism on Roth and we have all of the Roth novels and collections, but we do not have 7,000 the same 7,000 books that Roth has. So with the help of Sam and librarians in Newark, we had a leg up. We're really grateful for that collaboration. So thank you, Maren. I miss you. In our remaining time, you will hear from Dr. Ira Nadel, from Sam Graham-Felsen, a novelist in his own right and former blogger for Barack Obama and current historian at the Philip Roth Personal Library. And exemplifying new research in the field, you will hear from Rachele Puddu, a Fulbright scholar from Italy, now working with Dr. Miriam Jaffe at Rutgers University. With that itinerary in mind, our next speaker is Ira Nadel, who will reflect on his experiences not only as a guest editor of this issue on the Philip Roth Personal Library, but also as a contributor. Ira.
Well, thank you so much, Aimee and Maren, for the opportunity to follow up with my fanciful notion that we should devote one issue of Philip Roth Studies to the library itself. And what I want to take a moment or two to discuss is why. Why should we have done that? Why is it important? For many Roth scholars, it's not self-evident. You have to come to Newark, you have to come to the space, you have to work with the books, you have to draw on Sam's knowledge of what's really there to discover, because it is truly a process of discovery. And one of the things that we mentioned in the issue is that there's much more material here of a kind of ephemeral nature that is fascinating. Sticky notes that Roth put into copies of the books. He had this marvelous habit also of writing on the inside of book jackets. So if a book on McCarthy used for the Plot Against America was actually there, We didn't know what to do until you take the jacket off, and then in fact, you see that he's filled the whole interior with all sorts of information. So there are many, many discoveries. But the word I want to sort of put forward, which is a cliche, but I think is critical for anyone thinking and writing and studying about Roth, is the word legacy. This is a phenomenal legacy by one of America's most critical and significant writers. And one of the remarkable things about the legacy, it's in one place. This is where you go when you want to start to really discover from the books, the materials that Roth used to write. You go to Newark. Of course, the other repository of material is the Library of Congress and their very large Roth collection of papers, letters, drafts of the novels, etc. But the Roth Library is, I think, unique in that we have so much of his own kind of sense of discovery with these books themselves. In a sense, you're reading them with Philip Roth because you suddenly see he's underlined these passages or he's made marginal commentary on texts that we might not think is that unusual, but he's obviously found something quite significant in those passages. So the why, I think, why we did the issue is to almost democratize his library so that this issue gets into the hands of everyone and they can see what their own possibilities might be in terms of discovery in the library. There's one other dimension I'll quickly add, and that's the public dimension. That is to say, this material is available to anyone who wishes to come to the Newark Public Library. And I know in my various trips there, and sitting with Sam, there'd be a couple walking in saying, "What is this all about? Tell us again about who is Philip Roth. We are from Iowa, or we are from Connecticut, and we don't know too much about this." And this is a very significant aspect of it. And to Sam's credit and to the administration of the Newark Public Library, there are multiple public programs related to the library, to young writers programs, poetry classes, many, many things. So the library is more than just two beautiful rooms with Roth's materials. It's a kind of beacon, use another cliche, pushing outward about the general interest of literature by an individual who has these roots in Newark. And here you are in Newark. You can read, look at one of his texts, and then hop on a bus and go up to Week Wake High School and walk around the playing field if you've been studying Nemesis. This is remarkable. If you were to study Norman Mailer, well, you have to go to Austin, Texas to look at his papers, and you have to go to Wilkes University to look at his library. But this is Roth, in a sense, where Roth should be. So I think it's one of the greatest accomplishments of Philip Roth as an individual and as a writer, that he thought of and realized the existence of the library. And I hope that the journal with the 5 essays and the other ancillary material conveys that to everyone who picks it up. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ira. You mentioned, maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A later, but you used words such as beacon and public and legacy, which suggested to me this kind of outward-looking project, which might be seen as kind of ironic for people who think about Roth as introverted or very private. And I align myself with you in thinking that, like, you know, making these books, this whole library, democratic or democratized, will be so important for kind of building readers' sense of his work, his contribution to American culture for for so many, centuries later.
Yes, and if I could add just one more quick thing, what the library also reveals, which I think is critical if you are a high school student or Professor so-and-so, is the process of writing. And Sam has made some marvelous discoveries related to Nemesis and some books on summer camps and native explorations that are fantastic. And you come to understand the work more completely because we have his record, if you will, of writing. And that's what the library is.
I want to say a few things about Sam's work on American pastoral also. I will return to that in a minute. Thank you for bringing that up, Ira. And I feel like I've spoken a lot already. I don't want to take up a lot more airtime, but I was added to the program as someone who had the honor not only of co-editing this volume, but as somebody who was tapped by Ira to write an essay about Roth's reading of Erik Erikson, particularly Erikson's Young Man Luther, which is a psychoanalytic account of a son's cultural contributions in a world that stem from a relationship with his father. So I will just say this, and then we'll move on to exciting new work. I remembered reading the famous interview with Hermione Lee that she did with Roth for the Paris Review in 1984, and noting that when Lee notes, when she introduces the interview, all of the books in the stack beside them as they chatted. And she did not really seem to me to take advantage of that. In front of her was Roth the writer, and as Ira points up, Roth the reader. If she had thought for a few minutes longer about the titles, she could see that in 1984, Roth was working out something on fathers and sons. And yet she chose to ask him to comment on readers' criticisms of him as a writer of women, particularly in light of the novel When She Was Good. And if you go back to that interview, you will see that makes him crazy. It's like, why are we talking about this? So now that we have two biographies of Roth and one on the way, it is my hope that reading Roth can further develop our sense of who Roth was as a writer and a man. As with Sam's work, which you will hear about in a moment, following Roth's dog ears and underlines in his own copies of these apparently obscure books to passages in his own works, you can see how Roth's reading life transformed his writing. He is a writer's writer through and through. But speaking of Roth's biography, places he lived and visited, friends he knew, I had the pleasure of traveling a few weeks ago with our next speaker, Rachele Puddu, and her research mentor, Dr. Miri Jaffe, to Litchfield County in Connecticut, where Roth summered since the 1990s. There, we visited Roth's haunts by day and even met people who knew him. And we wrote about his representations of haunts or hauntedness by night. Rachele, like Sam, is a part of this next phase of Roth scholarship, a new generation inspired by this collection. Rachele, do you mind speaking a little bit about what you are working on these days?
Yes, thank you, Aimee, and good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Let me say, first of all, that I'm honored to be here and to be given this opportunity to discuss my work and what I'm doing here as a Fulbright at Rutgers University. So just like Aimee just said, in these past few months, I've had the opportunity to visit and witness firsthand Philip Roth's whereabouts, or Roth's homes. From the Beth Israel Hospital where he was born to the Week Wake section of the New York Public Library, where his identity as a reader and as a writer began to take shape. I saw his childhood home in Summit Avenue, his favorite everyday spots in Litchfield, Connecticut, and even his gravesite at Barn College Cemetery in upstate New York. I also went to Washington, D.C., I spent a few days going through the Philip Roth papers, where I was lucky enough to have a glimpse of what happened behind the scenes of his novels and short stories. I read some of his private correspondence with friends and fellow writers, and even found a restaurant menu which back in the 80s featured a dessert named after the fictional character of Lonoff. We all know how private Roth was about his life and his everyday activities, and especially in light of all the presumptions about the autobiographical nature of his fictional writing. And that is why I felt extremely lucky to be able to see and read maybe the most intimate part of his legacy, the books he owned and gifted to the New York Public Library. Here, I'm using the expression intimate part of his legacy because whenever I am climbing the steps of the library and I'm sitting in front of Roth's copies of books we all might have read at some point, I am reminded of a sentence from one of his books from 1981, Zuckerman Unbound. And in the book, there's a scene where Zuckerman is talking to the famous actress Cesare Auchi. And they are in the midst of a discussion about fame. And at one point, he picks up her copy of a Kierkegaard book in which he finds a few underlined pages. And suddenly he asks her, "What else have you underlined?" And she answers, "What everybody underlines, everything that says me." And I find this passage very fascinating, and I want to interpret it as a key that Roth gave us, almost a suggestion on how to approach his personal library. Most certainly, we can find traces of his private thoughts in the copies of the books he owned and that shaped him. I remember holding a copy of Henry James' selected short stories, which surprisingly didn't have many marginalia or highlights. And in the back of the front matter, I found two unwritten names, Helen and Alice. And below these two names, there were two columns of numbers in no particular order with a sum at the end. I wondered, were they playing cards between one reading section and the other, or maybe something else? I'm still trying to figure that one out. But the impression I got from holding that book, which I was consulting for an entirely different reason, given the importance of Henry James in Roth's writing, was that I was witnessing to a very intimate moment, which explains Roth's warning not to take pictures of the books. This approach of trying to find him within his own books can only be a starting point. As the issue of the Philip Roth Studies amazingly proves, we as scholars should gain a different perspective and try to reconstruct Roth's journey as a reader and only therefore as a writer by putting on different critical lenses. Concerning my specific work, at the moment, I'm trying to use the spectral approach, let's say. I am now hunting the ghosts that once haunted him. And I'm doing that by reading his books and searching for traces, not of his personal life, but traces of his fiction within the works of the writers he read and learned from. And what we learn from the Philip Roth Personal Library, in my opinion, is that not only in my opinion, but is that Roth was an avid reader during college and especially after it when he was teaching, and he was an eclectic one. He knew about the roots of American literature, but he ranged over the English, Eastern European, French, Russian, and even Italian literature. Starting from these premises, I started to indulge in the clues he gave us in his novels. I went through his copies of Hawthorne, Melville, Henry James, Malamud, and James Joyce, just to mention a few of them. For some of them, I was thrilled to find confirmation of my initial thoughts, of course. Those literary shadows suddenly became bright presences in the shape of pen marks, lines, and even little stars you would draw on the border of the page. And something that struck me that was even mentioned in the issue was that were the absences rather than the presences. And this, luckily enough, is a perfect fit for my research on ghosts, which for they are entities that are both present and absent. We don't find many annotations in Roth's copies of Henry James, Malamud, or James Joyce, even though his depth towards them is undeniable. With Malamud, he might have had a direct validation given their personal bond. For the other two, instead, the stains he left are very hard to detect. And maybe these are the ones that still need further scientific investigation. For Henry James, I thought I might have to look for a different kind of clues. We know how we influenced him, especially at the beginning of his career, when he was still trying to find his authorial voice and his style. Henry James might have helped him build his own house of fiction, just like the one Zuckerman inhabits, and he struggles to exit. In the case of James Joyce, I found more traces of Roth's pens in Dubliners rather than Ulysses. And interestingly enough, rather than even though not surprisingly, I found many annotations, many mentions of him in the manuscripts and drafts of some of Roth's major novels. To wrap up, I will briefly share something that I discovered that might be worth material for some future investigation. So back in Italy, I live in Trieste, a city that is famous for its literature. James Joyce wrote pieces of Ulysses there. And a few months ago, I was talking to a friend and we were discussing about another famous writer from Trieste, Italo Svevo, a pseudonym of Hector Smith, born from a Jewish German father and an Italian mother. In 1923, he published a pivotal modernist novel, Zeno's Conscience, whose main character closely resembled many of Roth's characters. We were wondering if Roth had ever read him. Flash forward to last month, I was working at the Philip Roth Personal Library and asked Sam for Roth's copies of the book, which I'd found out Roth actually owned. Needless to say, in some of the most pivotal scenes of the Svevo novels that Roth owned, I found Roth's pen mark. He had underlined quite a few sentences that closely resemble his own text. I'm sharing that to conclude my talk and basically to prove that Philip Roth Personal Library is a place that is full of surprises and full of materials that I'm sure will provide new scholarships for many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachele. I love that meta moment, that dialogue. What else have you underlined? And then what is the answer? Myself, of course, or what?
Whatever underlines everything that says me.
Everything that says me. And you end there too, right? Like so much of him is in his books, not only the books that he read, but also the books that he wrote. So we look forward to seeing you in print again soon. Our next speaker recently published an essay for the New York Times on September 27th with the headline, How a Book About Gloves Inspired a Masterpiece by Philip Roth. As Sam says in this essay, Roth takes the evocative particulars from Shtetl in the Adirondacks, the way thousands of stretched skins smoothed out the edges of the table, and heightens them by imagining the Swede encountering those edges as a boy, creating a passage surging with sensual longing, repression, and ultimately private release. This is all Sam. A boy pressing his skin into the skin-softened surface, physically merging with his family's trade. I love that sentence. You can tell Sam is also a novelist. Sam, do you mind talking about what it was like to discover that book, how it informs your new role in the library and other similar discoveries?
Sure. My face is gonna leave the camera for 1 second because I need to turn on the auto lights, which turned off during this, but I'll be right back. Okay. It looks like there they go. Okay, good. So hi everyone, thank you for having me. I am here in the library, in the Philip Roth Personal Library in Newark. We are open 6 days a week. One of the coolest things about this space is just how accessible it is. We are not just here for scholars. Anyone can come in and look at these books as long as they make an appointment with me. I'll just give one kind of random interesting example. I had a man who told me he had spent many years in prison, had been recently released, and wanted to look at a book that wasn't in the general collection, but happened to be in the Philip Roth Personal Library. It was Bonhoeffer's Letters from a German prisoner. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
And it's somewhere right behind me up there. And the gentleman, I explained to him that, what the rules were. You have to, can't use a pen, you have to use a pencil, you can't take pictures. But he sat there for hours at the table right in front of me, which was Philip Roth's dining table, carefully copying out quotes that Philip Roth had underlined. And clearly this was an important personal project to him. So that's just one example of how this library is not just being used by scholars or Roth fanatics necessarily, but being used by people from Newark who are taking advantage of their public library. So for me, I think what's been, as Ira mentioned, we also host various literary events for the public. On Thursday, we were here hosting a vibrant poetry workshop, which was a lot of fun. We had a woman last month run an Afro-Gothic horror writing workshop, which was very popular. We had a lot of people coming for that. And, I just imagine Philip Roth would have been delighted to know that this space isn't just sort of a museum, or a monument to him, but, living, breathing, literary incubator for the next generation of Newark writers. One other thing I'll just, promote here. We have an event next week, which is how to write a great college essay. Of course, I had to tease it with some pizza, but this other picture is of one of Philip Roth's typewriters. But that's the kind of thing we're doing here. Anything related to writing, good sentences, that's what we own, as our identity as part of the Newark Public Library. To me, Philip Roth, he's always been my favorite writer. That's why this is something of a dream job for me. And to me, I love him for many reasons, but it ultimately comes down to the fact that I think he is the great American sentence writer. You pick up any of his books and open to a random page and you'll be bowled over by a beautiful sentence. So I will talk about the shtetl in the Adirondacks discovery, which I literally made on, I think, on my second day working here. I've been here about 8 months or so, but I'll just give another, a few other very quick examples of the kinds of things that I'm finding here. Look, before I got this job, I had long been stunned at Philip Roth's productive output. Anyone who looks at his output should be stunned. 31 books. I would argue half of them are rightfully described as masterpieces, maybe even more than half. There are a few duds in there, but not too many. And I think the fact that he was able to write, to have that much to say, always stunned me because, I'm now working on my third novel. I'm in my 40s now, but it always is a major struggle for me to figure out, do I have anything left to say? And I always wondered, how the heck did Philip Roth have enough to say to fill 31 books? And I now understand it a lot better. Of course, he's drawing from his private personal experience, as all novelists do. Even, science fiction writers writing about aliens, the alien is really based on, Great Aunt Bessie or whatever. There's never anything that's fully drawn from nowhere. It's always drawn from scraps of life experience. And of course, Philip Roth's books were too. But I don't think that was enough for him to drive. It wasn't enough to give him the material to write 31 books, many of them brilliant books. He needed to bring in other sources other than his own personal life. And so he was, I think, basically a hybrid of a novelist, a journalist, and an historian. Some of the really cool stuff we have here, we have audio tape of him interviewing a gravedigger. And of course, you guys know well that went into one of the most beautiful scenes in Everyman, where there's a long description of specifically how a grave is dug. So that's the kind of thing we have here. But a lot of the material came from just dogged research, not just into history, but into sort of like esoteric. Well, I'll give some examples. For The Human Stain, I happen to be just sometimes when I'm in between projects or procrastinating on something, I'll just browse the shelves and look around and see what titles stand out to me. In a sort of reference section where Roth, by the way, had a tremendous number of reference books. And this is something to me that is really instructive as a novelist. He had, not just many dictionaries and thesauruses, but he had specific kinds of dictionaries. He had a dictionary of building materials. There are thousands of words to describe, all of the different parts of columns and eaves, and Roth wanted to know what those words were, and he put those words in his books. He had a dictionary of cliches. Roth loved cliches mostly because he loved poking holes in them. Famously in Sabbath Theater, the wonderful malapropisms of Drenka, nuts and bulbs, raining cats and something else. Anyway, but all of that, I imagine, didn't just come from, Roth jazzing around with whatever was in his head. I imagine him flipping through that dictionary of cliches and saying, hey, how can we find another cliche and make Drenka screw it up in a beautiful accidental poetry kind of way. So those are some of the things. But I'm back in this reference section, and I found not one, but 3 books about ice fishing. And of course, those books weren't just Roth trying to learn how to go ice fishing. Those books went into a few pages in The Human Stain, where he's describing Les Farley out on the lake in the winter in Massachusetts, sitting there, ice fishing. And, a normal novelist would look up ice fishing on Wikipedia and learn, all right, what are the 3 things you have to do? You have to get your crank, and you drill the hole, and then, how do you, stay warm? And then that would be enough for them. Philip Roth read 3 books about ice fishing, just for a few pages in one of his novels. That's the kind of rigor that he put into his novels, and that's how he got his energy and juice, I think. He had this obsession, with he famously said, I think at his 80th birthday, with describing every last American thing, that detail, and a lot of it came from really doing the nitty gritty research. I'll give another example. In Nemesis, the very last line of Roth's entire body of work is describing a man throwing a javelin, and I generally remember what the line was. Maybe one of you guys can help me out, but it's something about just the permanence or the perfection of throwing that javelin. Anyway, maybe it'll come back to me later. But look, it was an important thing, because I think Roth must have known, like, this could be the last line of fiction I ever write. And but he read an entire book about how to throw a javelin, and he underlined the specific mechanics of how the elbow should be above the shoulder, and how the hand should be following through after the javelin is released. All of that he got from this book. And again, I think a lesser, lazier novelist would have just, said, hey, this guy threw a javelin and he threw it really hard, and, it was great. That's not enough for Roth. Roth had to go all in. He had to know every last nitty gritty detail of how the javelin is thrown. And, I believe in the Blake Bailey biography, I read that Roth found Milan Kundera's description of a doctor in Unbearable Lightness of Being, I think, to be pretty lackluster. He said, that's not a real doctor. I can tell that, Kundera doesn't know a thing about what it is to be a doctor. And Roth, famously wrote about the kind of counter life fantasy of becoming a doctor in Zuckerman Unbound. And, again, you go back to the reference section, he's got Gray's Anatomy, which he really read Gray's Anatomy. He's got various medical textbooks. So he really wanted to know. And I imagine on top of all of that, he probably interviewed friends who were doctors. One of the things some of you scholars may know about this was a really cool discovery for me that I may end up writing about because I haven't seen much written about this, if anything. He wrote a whole book, I mean, a monograph, a short book, 50 or so pages, about a local doctor in Connecticut. I think he just did it as a favor to this. I think it must have been his doctor or a family friend or something.
Yeah,
But but it's a wonderful. Did you write about that in your book, Ira?
I referred to it. Yes, so it was his doctor.
Yeah,
He became very attached to him personally and wanted to acknowledge him, and so he
totally.
wrote this very short account.
And I have to imagine that on some level, it was also, Roth was just deeply curious specifically about doctors and, wanted to get even more material. So I will, part of why I came to the office today is I have my skeleton key here, and I just want to show you how serendipitous this was. But I'm sitting at my desk, which happens to be Philip Roth's old trestle table that was in his writing studio in Connecticut, which is now my desk. I have to tighten some of the bolts here. It's getting a little wobbly, the table, but I turned around and I saw right behind me, literally right here, right behind me, this book, Shtetl in the Adirondacks. I just thought it was a strange title. As I wrote in my Times essay, it would have been one thing if it was called Shtetl in the Catskills. I happen to have a personal pet interest in the Catskills. My wife's family has some roots there, and I was looking at that as a place to write some Jewish American fiction, as a place to set some of my own Jewish American fiction. So I said, who knew about a Shtetl? Who knew there even were Jews in the Adirondacks? So I start flipping through, and then immediately I realized, oh, okay, this is a pretty important book. It's filled with underlining about gloves. This is about the town of Gloversville, and I should say I got a pretty a polite but frustrated email from the son of the man who wrote this book after my piece was published, because he said, the New York Times said it was a book about gloves. It's not a book about gloves. It's a book about Gloversville, and he's right. Only part of it is about the glove making. It's also about other aspects of life in Gloversville, New York. But I was just so moved by seeing this because I think Sabbath Theater is a superior book, but I think American Pastoral is just the one that is my kind of pet favorite because it's for various reasons, and specifically the glove making scene is my favorite scene in all of Roth's work, and is part of what inspired me to want to become a novelist. And then I was able to see, this is where he learned about gloves. I had always wondered, like, how did he know so much about gloves? Why was he so interested in it? And this book offered the clues that I needed to understand how he wrote this marvelous scene. And I think, again, just to wrap up, like, it's not enough to just go on Wikipedia and Google, how do gloves get made, and get one sentence or maybe one technical term like a trank or a spud knife or whatever. That is certainly was not enough for Philip Roth. For Philip Roth to write the beautiful scene that he wrote, I think he needed to feel like he knew everything about how gloves were made. And of course, he didn't just read this book. He went to Gloversville. He met with glovers. He even made a pair of pretty badly made gloves that apparently sat at, maybe I got this from your book, Ira, they sat in his wood pile for many years. He used them to gather wood. So he clearly was proud that he had made these gloves. But again, the reason why this scene is so powerful is because he builds to this beautiful rhapsody about how the human hand is and the opposable thumb, and this is what distinguishes us from animals and from the apes, is our hands, and in order for that to land, in order for that to feel so powerful coming out of the Swede, you needed to really believe that the Swede was a real glove maker and really loved his trade. And that's why the sentence Aimee read was the most moving part to me, was when Roth imagines the Swede as a boy, actually rubbing his face against the corners of these tables, showing how this is not just a job, but this is, a deeply felt connection to a trade that he loved and that his father passed down to him, and of course, which his beloved daughter Mary detonated, in a second. So anyway, it's been a pleasure talking about this, and thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much, Sam. Mary, who is here with us, found the sentence, I think. Mary Rolls, do you want to read it? I think we could unmute you. Let me see if I can do that.
Okay, I'm unmuted.
Hi,
Actually,
Mary.
that was from the book that our book group, the last book we've read all 31, and that's from Sabbath Theater about the discus, the brother in that story, the dead brother in that story. But I just found the Nemesis quote. You could see each of his muscles bulging when he released it into the air. He let out a strangulated yowl of effort, one we all went around imitating for days afterward, a noise expressing the essence of him, the naked battle cry of striving excellence. It was as though our playground director had turned into a primordial man hunting for food on the plains where he foraged, taming the wilds by the might of his hand. Never were we more in awe of anyone. Through him, we boys had left the little story of the neighborhood and entered the historical saga of our ancient gender.
Thank you so much.
You know what? I was specifically, he comes back to the javelin at the very, very, very last line of Nemesis. I don't know if you have it in front of you, but if you do, read us the very, very last sentence of that book.
Well, I think it's important that invincible is the very last word of Nemesis. And to put it in your context, Sam, somehow the ironic last word of Roth's fictional writing. And I think that's significant. Invincible. It's also ironic, given reaction to the whole set of books. I'm thinking, a kind of reevaluations, obituaries, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's really critical. Invincible is the word he wants to end on, not stop, but end. It's a kind of conclusion to the writing in a lot of ways. It's a hope. It's a hope that everything that he's done will remain invincible.
And I think the studious approach is so important for understanding or like thinking about Roth's legacy. This might seem very like naive, but for so long I thought that Roth was a gifted genius, and he is obviously a gifted genius. That sentences like the one Mary read just like poured out of him. And so, I'm left thinking, well, what do you mean you can't take care of two cats? You are inspired with this writing that just goes right into your head and out of your fingertips. But if you think about the fact that instead he was a scholar, he was doing all of this work. He read and read and read for hours and hours and hours for, like 1 or 2 hours of writing. I find that inspiring in another way, which is, like he put in the work. If you put in the work, that, there is hope. You don't have to wait for the divine inspiration to like write 31 books or, make a difference.
No, totally.
I think also, yeah, just to add again on a comment of Sam's, the critical word for Roth as a writer is the word how. How does this happen? How do you dig a grave? How do you make a glove? How do you drive from Connecticut to New York? How does a puppet operate? And this is one of the things I think that's so critical in trying to approach his work. And you've just demonstrated beautifully, Sam, the kinds of research that he did and that he deeply needed to know how this event occurred or this activity. And even those questions become spiritual. How do I act and behave as a Jewish writer? How do I understand the experiences of Israel? I go there, I try to grapple with the contradictions. How do I, and then we could just fill in the blank. So I like the word how. I think that's very, very important, which you've illustrated beautifully.
I think we have some minutes for questions. I was wondering if the panelists have questions for one another. If so, we can talk amongst ourselves while maybe people in the audience type questions in the chat, and then we can call on people the way we did with Mary to unmute. So if you have questions, please type them. Oh, there, I see a hand already. That is Kate S. I'm going to ask you to oh, is that all right? Or should we have Kate type her question in the chat first?
I think we can just ask to unmute.
Okay. So Kate, I'm going to unmute you.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I've been asking these questions throughout all our Philip Roth Zoom calls, and I would love to know your opinion. Why no Nobel Prize? Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Kate.
That's,
Ira, do you want to take that?
Well, I mean, how much time do we have? We need the rest of the weekend to answer that question. There's so many multiple complex reasons, and it has a lot to do with timing. It has a lot to do with the selection of American writers. It has a lot to do with the parameters of the Nobel Committee, which changes. There's no simple answer to it at all. It was a disappointment to him, but I think in the latter part of his life, it was satiric. And if you looked at my account or even Blake's account, Blake Bailey, there was a counter Nobel Prize event the very night that the Nobel was awarded in Sweden. I forgot the year, maybe, I don't know, 2016 or something, that a group of his friends organized through the Swedish Jewish Community Federation. And it was meant as a kind of comic, okay, the Academy, Swedish Academy won't give him the award, but we're going to give him an award. And they did it the same night. So it's a kind of, in law, a kind of moot case, all right, a moot question. I think in the beginning it meant something to him. By the end, if they're going to give it to X, Y, or Z, so what? It doesn't matter. To whom it mattered the most, I think, his publishers and his publicists and his agent, because they could see if Philip Roth won the Nobel Prize, the sales of his books would skyrocket. Anyway, that's one answer.
And I just my friends and I have a long-running 20-year-old email thread, and every year during the Nobel Prize, I used to complain that Roth didn't win again, and then one of my friends who's a fellow writer, always would remind me he's in good company with Proust and Kafka and James Joyce and many other greats. So
and Tolstoy as well.
Right. So, but the thing I wanted to add was that I wanted to mention that I have started a new podcast, and it is called Roth and Company. The idea of the podcast is to invite contemporary writers, novelists, and critics to discuss Roth's 31 books. I was a little nervous when I launched it that it would be hard to get people to get other novelists and critics of my generation to come on the show, because I wasn't sure if Roth wasn't popular enough anymore, or if in some people's minds he's been canceled or whatever. But people, what I have found is just that literary writers of my generation, if you ask them what they think of Philip Roth, they all love him. They all love him. I mean, I have they. So I just had Garth Greenwell, who's I think one of the finest young novelists writing today, on to discuss Sabbath theater, and Garth was making the case that Sabbath theater is basically up there with the greatest literature ever written, up there with Shakespeare and Tolstoy. If you ask people who the best American writer of the past 100 years are, a lot of people are going to, a lot of at least serious people are going to say Philip Roth. And I think Roth must have known how highly he was held in esteem by other fellow writers, and that must have given him some solace, given that he never won the Nobel Prize.
Can I again throw in 2 cents? It's the craft of writing that Philip Roth constantly displayed, which I think is going to be one of the lasting elements. I'm excusing theme, I'm excusing the unorthodoxy of Portnoy's complaint in 1969, but I think it's Roth as a writer, which is really, and I mean by that the craft and practice of writing that is really fundamental. And you mentioned earlier, Sam, the notion of the sentence. Well, I don't want to go on, but next year, I've recently completed something called The American Sentence, and it'll be coming out next year, a book, and Roth figures in that, as you can imagine. So it's about the craft of writing American sentences, and is there an American sentence? What are its characteristics, et cetera, and how different forms of American communication shaped the American sentence. So I'm glad you mentioned the sentence. Critical.
Connecting the question of the Nobel with the question or the fact of the sentence, some of you might have this experience also, like when Roth was alive, I think we were all kind of steeling ourselves for the call that would come from a journalist saying, what do you think about Roth winning the Nobel? And so every year I had this, speech prepared about how he was a writer's writer, how significant that is to all of us writers. And now I'm thinking, well, maybe that's the point, or like that was not lost on the Nobel Award Committee. But instead, like we're talking about this now after his death, and I think the same thing remains true. He is a writer's writer, and many of us kind of came to him because we love sentences. And so I wanted to ask Sam and maybe Rachele also, like seeing the pizza on the flyer for how to write a good college admissions essay had me thinking that maybe maybe there are 18-year-olds or 25-year-olds who pick up a novel the way we did Portnoy's Complaint and think, yes, this is great. Like the conversation will continue. I'd like to hope. I was wondering if you see any evidence of that in addition to your podcast, Sam.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again? I got distracted by a patron for a second. Sorry.
I want to be reassured that there is another generation, the 18 to 28-year-olds who pick up a novel for the first time or go to a how to write a college essay workshop, like find affinity with Roth as we did.
Yeah, I mean, this is just, a random example, but I'm gonna have a young woman who's a reporter for the New York Times named Emma Goldberg, who writes about Jewish American politics and culture, come on to discuss Operation Shylock. And I think, she's in her, I think, late 20s now, but, I saw her actually, I discovered that she was a Roth fan because I saw her at the Roth at 90 event. And what I was pleasantly surprised by at that event was that there were a lot of 20-something faces in the room. I think, look, Roth talked a lot towards the end of his life about how, the novel was an increasingly obscure pastime, that the literary novel would be up there with, Latin poetry in terms of the audience. And I think that was probably exaggerated. But what I have found is, and again, I'm in my 40s. I can't speak for Gen Zers or whatever, but what I have found is that there is this countervailing trend with social media and short form, distraction kind of content proliferating so much. I have found that there is a countervailing trend of like people going back to novels, and I think as counter programming from the maddening deluge of social media. And one of the things that I'm really one of the things I'm trying to do with the podcast, which I know is a form that well, all people of all generations listen to podcasts, but certainly younger folks don't tune into NPR like I do now. They can just go straight to the podcast. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm starting with the books that I think are most relevant to the discourse right now. I'm going to have another conversation coming up with Andrew Marantz, who's a New Yorker writer who writes about fascism. He's going to come on to talk about the plot against America. And we're going to do an episode as soon as possible on human stain. With so much going on, particularly in America right now after these elections, I think people, I have noticed online on social media, because I search for Philip Roth's name on social media, people are turning to Philip Roth to make sense of what the heck just happened. He was so prescient and he understood America so deeply, and I think people are finding solace in his work. So that's something that gives me hope that his legacy continues. In some ways, is more important now than it ever has been.
I agree. Rachele, do you want to add to that as a member of this new generation?
Yeah, first of all, I'm speaking from a Gen Z millennial perspective. I started reading Roth when I was 21. And so I was reading that, and I was struck not only by his writing, but by the stories he wrote. People still need stories. And I remember that interview where he said that in 20 years, people won't be reading books anymore. And that, I don't know if that's the case. What I'm seeing in terms of what my generation is doing with books and stories, that some of them, of course, they don't have any idea about literature, but some of them, the majority of them, still read. And so this gives me hope. And I don't know, we'll see.
I think we're a little over time. I would love for Rachele to have the last word on that, the word of hope. Are there any other questions or closing comments or thoughts before we end our Zoom together?
I just think that everyone who has participated today and who's listened and watched goes to the Philip Roth Library in Newark. It's a great experience. It's 10 or 11 minutes by train from Penn Station. I speak from experience. There really is no excuse for not going. If you're interested in Roth, even if you only have an hour, you will walk away with a stronger, I think, understanding of who this writer was and why he remains so critically important as we have been discussing here. So I will say, on a personal note, Philip Roth and I were born in the same hospital, but not the same year. I want to know that. So I do have a kind of connection. My mother was from Newark, so I live in Vancouver, which is not close to Newark, but I feel strongly that this is a very important location, the library and Newark, and we should all explore. That's why you go, to explore.
Thank you, Ira. And thank you for all of your service and, work toward building this legacy and building up, the future scholarship. So you've been such an important mentor to all of us.
Great.
Sam, do you have any closing words on behalf of the library? And we thank you for hosting today.
Well, just that, you know, I'm here for you guys. So, if you haven't been here, come. It's a cool experience. And you know, you can go on our website, prpl.npl.org. You can find a list of all the books in here, and you can email me and set up an appointment to look at them. You know, and there's so much undiscovered stuff in here. I think the last time Ira came, I was just showing him that I had been uh, thinking about Israel and anti-Semitism just because of what was going on in the news, and I went and looked at his um, markings on Primo Levi, and there's just a great wealth of underlinings and marginalia there that you know, I just kind of randomly decided, well, not randomly, but you know, sort of somewhat serendipitously decided to open those books. You know, there's 7,000 books here. I have not even scratched the surface. So you guys can help me do that by deciding what you're interested in and coming here and poking around. And I think there's a lot more to be discovered.
Thank you so much. I see Bernie Rogers is here. I want to thank Bernie. I think Maren dropped off, but I'd like to thank her again. We were connected at the hip for 5 years as we worked on Philip Roth Studies, and then particularly with this last issue. And then finally, to everybody who showed up today, we were talking before 2 o'clock that in Connecticut, at least, I'm not sure if this is true in New Jersey, but it's 60 degrees and sunny in November. So we appreciate your being here and your support, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. So
Thank
bye-bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.